All right, so this next lecture is chapter 28, as you can see, the reproductive system. And in this lecture, we'll be looking at a little bit of the anatomy of the reproductive system, but that's mostly a lab topic. So what we'll be focusing on mostly is the formation of gametes, the gametes from the male and female, and where they come from and how they're formed. And then in the next chapter, which is development, we'll see what happens when you fuse these gametes from the male and the female and how that works and leads to the 9-month gestational period if fertilization occurs. Sort of how these last two chapters are related. So, but again, mostly we'll focus on the physiology of gamete formation in this reproductive system lecture. All right, so of all the organ systems we've looked at in A&P 1 and 2 now, this is the only one that really isn't essential to the life of the individual. Like someone does not have to reproduce, essentially, in order to maintain their health. But these hormones that are released do have a significant impact on growth and development and affects other systems in the body. And the primary male and function of these male and female reproductive organs really is to produce and store these cells that, again, if they come together, would combine to form the individuals, but they don't necessarily have to from that sort of standpoint. But as I said, the reproductive organs secrete hormones that we'll see, testosterone primarily in men, estrogen in women, that plays very significant roles in overall their development, but also normal sexual function, as we'll look at in this chapter. So the reproductive structures, again, then, these are the structures that actually produce the gametes, the male and female gametes that could fuse together at fertilization, but also the hormones. So those will be the things we'll focus on mostly, the organs and what they produce, which are the gametes and the hormones. There are ductal pathways that receive and transport these gametes after they're formed, and we'll look at those pathways. There are really important accessory glands that secrete fluids in these ducts that are actually essential for the maturation and development of these gametes. And then again, like I said, we'll do a little bit of external genitalia analysis to make sure we understand this pathway of how these reproductive components are formed. All right, so the reproductive tract then is, again, just the pathway, the chamber or passageway that connects these, sex organs to the exterior of the body. And so the male and female reproductive system are quite different functionally, right? The female produces 1 gamete per month and ultimately retains and nurtures the zygote if fertilization occurs. The male produces large quantities of gametes, known as sperm, and men produce about 0.5 million sperm per day. So there's quite a bit of sperm formation, and so in terms of how these two different male and female reproductive systems work, they're quite different. So we'll explore those topics as well. The male reproductive system, the gonads of the male are the testes, right? And the testes do two things that we're going to be focused on, right? Number one is secrete male sex hormones, androgens, like testosterone, for instance. But then they also produce the male gamete or sperm, and we'll look at how that is formed and sort of the life cycle of sperm and how they're able to progress and develop. Female reproductive system also has gonads, and we probably typically associate that with the male and the testes, but the female gonads are referred to as ovaries, and the ovaries also produce hormones like estrogen, for instance, but also release at what's called ovulation, 1 immature gamete or oocyte per month into what are called the uterine tubes, and the uterine tubes carry the oocytes to the uterus. If a sperm reaches an oocyte, fertilization is initiated, and the oocyte can mature and develop. The uterus is ultimately the link or the connection between the ovaries and the uterine tube, and ultimately would enclose and support a developing embryo if fertilization occurs. And then the vagina, of course, is the connection with the uterus to the exterior, and we'll see a similar, connection and passageways. We'll look at the male external genitalia. All right, so what we're going to do first is we'll do male and female, do the male reproductive first, And again, as I said, really what we want to look at is how sperm is formed, right? And so the pathway basically begins at the testes, right? From there it goes to what's called the epididymis, then to the vas deferens or ductus deferens, ejaculatory duct, and then finally the urethra. So we want to look at those components. Also, there are essential accessory organs that secrete fluids into this ejaculatory duct or pathway and urethra that are essential for the formation of what's called semen, which helps with the maturation of sperm. And those are the seminal glands, the prostate glands, and the bulbourethral glands, or those accessory structures. The scrotum encloses the testes. The penis is the erectile organ, which contains a distal portion of the urethra, so it's shared with the urinary pathway. And so you can see those images, or see those components in these images here. You have the testes being the first part, and then you have what's called the epididymis, which is the next segment of the pathway. Then you have the vas deferens. You can see the urinary bladder in that image as well. And then on the back side, you can see the seminal gland here, the prostate, and then ultimately the bulbourethral gland, and then ultimately working its way down into the urethra. All right, so how is sperm formed? As I said, that's sort of the primary physiological topic we want to look at is spermatogenesis, the actual process of sperm production and formation. And it begins in what's called the seminiferous tubules. And we look at this in the lab a little bit. And there are multiple layers of cells in these seminiferous tubules that move towards a lumen. And so spermatogenesis basically begins at the outermost layer, cell layer in these seminiferous tubules, and ultimately as they mature and develop, they're going to proceed towards the lumen, and the lumen ultimately will move them along the induction passageway. And so here's a nice shot, cross-section through the testes, and you can see very nicely the seminiferous tubules, which are all of these structures here, for instance. Right? These are all sections of seminiferous tubules. So this highly coiled seminiferous tubule system, which ultimately is going to drain into the epididymis, which you can see part of that up in this image here. And so that's ultimately where these things are going to form. And so the cells of spermatogenesis, the spermatogonia, divide by mitosis and produce two daughter cells. One remains, of course, and the second differentiates into what we call a primary spermatocyte. So it's a cell division, very typical basic biological function that you probably studied this in Intro to Biology and other classes. And so primary spermatocytes begin in meiosis and ultimately form these secondary spermatocytes. And so that's what we want to look at in terms of this passageway. Secondary spermatocytes differentiate into immature gametes, which we call spermatids. Spermatids then into spermatozoa. And so when they're at this stage called the spermatozoa, basically that's when they're in the lumen of the seminiferous tubule and can proceed on to the next level. Right? And so here is something we looked at in lab, for instance. This is a cross-section through a seminiferous tubule, and you can see the many layers sort of cells. And as I said, they're proceeding toward the lumen in terms of maturation process. It would start out further and gradually develop until they finally reach the lumen, at which point then they can move on to this next segment of the pathway. Okay? And so here's a really nice close-in shot of one seminiferous tubule, and you can see cells at different levels of development. There are also things like nurse cells and interstitial cells that help with development, but you can see spermatogonia, spermatids, and then finally you can see the heads of the maturing spermatozoa that ultimately will reach the lumen. All right, so as we said, contents in these seminiferous tubules are basically these cells at varying stages of development, like spermatogonia and spermatids, and et cetera. But then also, as I mentioned, you have these things called large nurse cells that help with the development and formation and progression of the development of these spermatogonia. Right? And so here's a nice illustration showing all the different layers of cells in one cross-section of a seminiferous tubule. Right? And so you can see out the outer layers and they gradually just work their way in to the lumen, where ultimately will be the final stage before moving on to the next step in the pathway. So the process then of spermatogenesis involves these three components: mitosis and meiosis, of course, but then also what we call spermiogenesis. And mitosis, again, is just part of that somatic cell division that we talked about, where you have one stem cell that divides and produces these two, what we call diploid daughter cells. And they have identical pair of chromosomes at this point. And so here's a nice illustration showing the mitosis, right? You have a cell, a stem cell divides and produces 1, 2 daughter cells, and the chromosomes, as said, at that point are identical. Meiosis, then, is a special form of cell division involved only in the gametes. And so we'll see spermatozoa and oocytes, spermatozoa and male oocytes and females. Gametes contain basically 23. Once they get to this form of meiosis, contain 23 chromosomes, half the normal amount, of course, in fusion. Will give you your 46 chromosomes that produce a zygote, right? That ultimately could potentially be nurtured and develop in the uterus over the 9-month gestational period. So, seminiferous tubules then begin with primary spermatocytes, produce spermatids, and then move on through that process. And so here you can see meiosis, and then meiosis 1 and 2 in terms of the formation of these structures. All right? So spermiogenesis then begins with spermatids, pretty small, unspecialized cells at this point, but as they go through spermiogenesis, they basically differentiate in what we know as spermatozoa. And these spermatozoa are highly specialized cells. So this is sort of a separate, first you have mitosis and meiosis, and then you have a separate process of spermiogenesis. Because really after mitosis and meiosis, it's still just sort of a, again, not a very highly specialized cell at that point. It still needs to differentiate in order to meet that process. So in spermatogenesis, as we see, again, we see mitosis, and then meiosis 1, showing the nice division where you have this secondary spermatocytes, and then spermiogenesis at meiosis 2, and then finally the process of spermiogenesis. If you look at the previous slide, meiosis 2, again, so just a pretty typical cell in terms of its structure, but then when it goes through spermiogenesis, this is where we start to see it take more of the shape of what you know as a sperm. And again, it's not totally mature at that point. It's just called a spermatozoa. Takes about 5 weeks to complete in this spermatogenesis process. So spermiogenesis then is the last process of this overall steps. And so each spermatid matures into one spermatozoon. And again, as these nerve cells are found in the different layers of the seminiferous tubules, they're going to attach to these cells and help with the maturation and formation in spermiogenesis. All right? And then spermiation, which is sort of the last step, it's ultimately going to lose attachment to the nerve cell, and as I said, enter the lumen of the seminiferous tubule. Once it enters the lumen of the seminiferous tubule, it's reasonably mature at that point, but it still needs secretions from the different glands, accessory glands that we talked about, like the prostate gland, for instance, and the seminal glands, to ultimately be mature and capable of fertilization. But this process of spermatogonal division to spermiation takes about 9 weeks in terms of the cell division formation. All right? All right, so once you reach a spermatozoon, the anatomy, again, is more unique, right? It has a head, a neck, middle piece, and tail that gives it more of the characteristic appearance. So if you look at this image, this is a nice sort of progression from a spermatid, which again is more just sort of a more generalized cell, right? It has a nucleus, has a cell membrane, has mitochondria, has a Golgi, to ultimately looking something that's more like a sperm, right? And so that's what we want to look at in terms of this process. So First thing, again, are these different sections of a spermatozoa, and that is first what's known as a head, which is just sort of a flattened circle, essentially, that contains all the nuclear material and the chromosomal material. But it also has an acrosome. Acrosome is the sort of cap-like tip of the head that contains enzymes that are essential to fertilization. Basically, this acrosome forms from the spermato's Golgi, contains these enzymes, and they're going to help with penetration at the oocyte when fertilization occurs. So that's a really important structure, the acrosome. Middle piece has this little neck that contains primarily the mitochondria, and the mitochondria, of course, you can provide ATP to move the tail from that standpoint. And then the tail, again, is the only flagellum in the human body. It's sort of a whip-like structure and allows the cell to move from one place to another. So these sperm actually swim. But again, that developmental process takes a little bit of time for it to form. And so, again, back to this image, you can see all these different structures forming. You can see the acrosome forming from the Golgi. You can see the nucleus sort of coming together. You can see the mitochondria helping fuse into the neck, and then ultimately the tail adding on. And so this process takes about 5 weeks in terms of spermatogenesis. And so here is a mature spermatozoan. At week 5 at the end, again, you can see the nucleus, where it's located, the acrosomal head, the mitochondrial spiral, which is the middle piece. It has all the ATP formation and energy for the tail, which is ultimately longer and allow for the sperm to move. And so there's a nice image of those. So you can sort of get a feel for these processes in terms of sperm formation. All right. So again, at this point, the testes produce physically mature spermatozoa, which is what we saw in this previous picture, spermatozoa in week 5. But at this point, the spermatozoa cannot fertilize an oocyte. Okay, again, we need these accessory components of the reproductive path are essential for the ultimate functional maturation, nourishment, and movement of these sperm along the pathway. So we'll talk about that process in a little bit. But again, at this point, it's physically mature, and it looks like what you typically associate with a sperm, but it's not yet capable of fertilization. And we'll talk about how that works, right? So the spermatozoa detach from the nurse cell. They're free in the seminiferous tubule, but again are functionally immature. They cannot move, right? The tail cannot move that well yet, and they are not capable of fertilization either. And so to go from the initial lumen of the seminiferous tubule when they detach from the nerve cell through the epididymis and through the ductus deferens, the lining of the epididymis actually has cilia. And the cilia, as you guys recall from grade P1, cilia we found also in our respiratory pathway, right, and help move mucus and keep our airway open. And so these cilia also help with the movement of sperm since they're not able of mobility at this point yet. All right, so that's what happens in the testes. This is the initial formation of the spermatozoa. The next segment is what's known as the epididymis. And so this is truly the start of the new male reproductive tract or pathway, right? Because what we've seen so far is what's occurred in the testes and the seminiferous tubule. The epididymis is this coiled tube that would measure almost 23 feet long, but again, highly folded inside the body. And has a head, body, and a tail. And so here you can see again the testes in terms of where that forms, and then ultimately sort of the last stage is the root testes, and that leads into the epididymis. And so the epididymis is essentially this structure here, right? And it's this highly folded tubular pathway that leads into the vas deferens, which we can see starting right here in the ductus deferens, right? So testes, epididymis, vas deferens are spermatic, part of that pathway. Okay? And so the functions, what is the epididymis? Why is it so important? Well, number one, it's going to monitor and ingest the fluid that's produced by the seminiferous tubules. So during that developmental process, the seminiferous tubules can produce some fluid that will come out into the epididymis, and the epididymis can help adjust that. also is going to be responsible for determining and recycling any sperm that are not, formed correctly or they've been damaged in the process. But also it has a nice location for storage and protection, and also can help facilitate functional maturation of sperm at this point, right? And so that's the epididymis, right? And so it's the part that's attached to the testes before we move into the long spermatic cord of the vas deferens. So spermatozoa then go through this epididymis, and they, as I said, they start to enter into the vas deferens, and at this point they're mature, but again still immobile, right? And they become motile, or actively swimming and functional, when they undergo what's called capacitation, which will come at a later point. And the two steps involved in capacitation: number one, the sperm becomes increasing their motility. Basically, the primary seminal glands, the content of semen is going to help these, give them not only the energy, the sugar that's needed to produce ATP for movement, but also will become capable of fertilization, right? And so these are the two steps that are essential. So not only the different seminal gland secretions, but also when exposed to the female reproductive pathway are the two steps that are essentially for the ultimate maturation of these sperm, right? So after the epididymis, then we have the ductus deferens, or vas deferens. So you've probably heard of a vasectomy, right? When a person would have this cord, part of this cord removed, because this is the pathway that leads from the epididymis all the way through the rest of the ejaculatory duct. So if you eliminate this, right, there's no way for the sperm to continue on in the pathway. So that's when men are essentially sterile if they have this vas deferens removed or have a vasectomy. Okay? So vasectomy is about 16 to 18 inches long, begins at the epididymis and ascends through the inguinal canal. Ultimately contains smooth muscle, which is going to help with movement as it moves towards the prostate gland and the seminiferous gland. The seminal gland. The ductus deferens, again, also we see cilia in this location, and so the peristaltic contractions of the cilia, of the smooth muscle also move the cilia, and we get this movement so that the spermatozoa can move through this region. Now, this ductus deferens can also store spermatozoa for several months. Again, because they haven't gone through capacitation yet, these sperm are really sort of almost in a suspended state of animation, right? They're very low metabolic rates. They don't have a whole lot of activity at this point, so they're just, can stay in this region for a few months before they move on to the next pathway. Right? And so here you can see nicely the tail end of the vas deferens, and then ultimately it swells a little bit. We call it the ampulla of the vas deferens, and ultimately moves into what we call the prostatic urethra. And you can see the seminal glands, right, are going to have secretions that are going to dump in with prostatic secretions, and everything sort of meets in this location at the prostatic urethra. So it's a nice image of all that coming together. It sits right along the urinary bladder. You can see the ureter, which we just talked about previously, is going to share, the urinary system is going to share the pathway with the ejaculatory tract, right? So here's a nice shot of the lumen of the vas deferens, the ductus deferens. You can see, so it's somewhat collapsed, but again has the cilia extending off of the surface. And look at all that nice smooth muscle. It can contract, and again that's going to help by peristalsis, the movement of these sperm along the pathway. And so the ejaculatory duct, it's a relatively short pathway, penetrates the wall of the prostate glands and then empties into the urethra. And at this point, we start to see the really essential accessory glands, which are going to ultimately produce what we know as semen. Basically, semen is just a mixture of secretions from these three different glands: seminal, prostate, and bulbar urethra. Okay? And so each one has something unique that it brings to the table in terms of its secretion. Okay? And so what are the functions then of these three glands? Well, again, as I said before, initiating capacitation, really activating these sperm. Okay? They're also providing nutrients needed for motility, right? So you have a high areas high in fructose and sugar and things like that, so that can produce, the mitochondria can produce ATP. They can also propel spermatozoa and this fluid along the reproductive pathway via these peristaltic contractions. Another thing that's going to be really important is producing buffers. Okay, you're going to the sperm are going to counteract some acidity along the way, not only in their own urethra but also in the vaginal environment, and they need to sort of counteract that acidity, so there are buffers that will be secreted within this glandular secretion. So really important, the semen is essential to the movement and overall health and maturity and fertilization capability of these sperm that are formed. All right, so let's look at each one then and sort of see what they're about, what they look like, and what they contribute. So first one, seminal gland or seminal vesicle. You saw this in the rat dissection as well if you had a male rat. And if you go back, you can see it in this image right here, right? Seminal gland, right? And so the seminal gland, obviously the term semen associated with seminal vesicles, and 60% of semen volume comes from these seminal glands. So a really important gland. It's a coiled tubular gland, extremely active secretions, again producing a large amount of seminal volume. And the fluid has the same sort of osmotic concentration, but not exactly the same as blood. But again, as I said, high concentration of fructose. This is easily metabolized by the spermatozoa, produce ATP, and also give it energy, right? And so, but the prostaglandins that are also found in the seminal fluid can stimulate smooth muscle to contract, and that's also going to help with the movement. And we're going to see these smooth muscle contractions are essential. And then finally, the seminal fluid is slightly alkaline, which, as I said, is going to help with neutralization of the acidity that it's going to counter, for instance, in the prostate pathway, in the urethral pathway, and then ultimately in the vagina as well. So really important fluids, secretions from the seminal gland are essential. Okay, and so as I said, the seminal fluid initiates this first step in capacitation. Spermatozoa begin beating the flagella and become highly motile, and the motility increases and they're able to move. And ultimately, the seminal fluid is discharged into the ejaculatory duct as emission, and these contractions, again, are controlled by the sympathetic pathway, allowing for release of these sperm into this pathway. All right, and so again, there you can see the nice shot of the seminal gland, all right, the seminal vesicle. And here's a cross-section through the seminal gland. You can see all the nice smooth muscle, but then you can see all the secretory components within that as well. All right, next on the pathway is the prostate gland. Prostate is a small muscular organ, encircles the part of the urethra, so the urinary pathway passes right through the prostate gland, as we talked about last time, and again surrounded by smooth muscle fibers. Prostatic fluid is actually slightly acidic, as we said. The fluid coming from the semen is more, from the seminal gland is more alkaline, and so it sort of counteracts that acidity that you see at the prostate. Forms about 20 to 30% of semen volume, so the vast majority is coming from the seminal glands and the prostate in terms of the actual semen volume. Also contains what's called seminal plasma, which is sort of an antibiotic for protection, and is ejected, of course, into the prostatic urethra, and peristalsis helps with movement along this pathway. So here you can see the prostate. Talked a little bit about the prostate gland last time. In the urinary pathway, this gland can be problematic for men. You can have prostate cancer, which is one thing, but also you can get enlargement of the prostate. The prostate, as you see, has a urethra that connects the urinary pathway with the ejaculatory duct, the one and the same, part of the same pathway. But as this prostate begins to increase in size, this prostatic urethra is going to narrow. And so sometimes it makes how easily the fluid flows through the prostatic urethra more difficult, and so it men that have an enlarged prostate can have difficulty creating a significant stream for urine to be released. So that's one of the things. But again, prostate cancer is also fairly common, significant concern with the prostate as well. So here's a histological cross-section of the prostate, as you can see in that. Finally, the last one is the vulvar gland, and this is also referred to as Cowper's glands, and these, again, located at the base of the penis, round in shape, but again, not contributing quite as much. Also providing a significant buffer. The mucus, the secretion is a little bit thicker, and also helps lubricate the front portion of the penis. So, and so this is the last gland along this pathway. So again, we see neutralization of acids that may be in the urinary pathway, as I was talking about previously. So as you can see, each gland is bringing a significant contribution along the way, and here are the vulvar glands. All right, and there's a nice cross-section, histological view of that. All right, so semen then, again, a typical ejaculation produces about 2 to 5 mL of semen. If the male is not producing enough volume of semen, less than that, that could be problems, right? You could have prostate issues or seminal gland issues, because those, again, are the primary contributors of semen volume. And if you have that, it's going to impact how capable a man is of fertilization. So sperm count can also be taken from semen, typically taken about a day or so after sexual abstinence, and typically is going to have about 20 to 100 million sperm per ml of ejaculate. So if you think 2 to 5 mL, then you're going to have maybe 500 million sperm potentially. So that's what you will see in that regard. All right, so what about hormones? So that's basically showing you how the sperm are formed, not only in the testes, but then also the contributions from the accessory glands that are essential to capacitation. Next thing we want to look at in the male reproductive pathway are hormones that are produced and the impact they have on the male reproductive system. Okay? And so if you recall from ANP1, when we talked about the endocrine system, we saw the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland releases 2 hormones that are associated with the reproductive system, FSH and LH, and respond to GnRH from the pituitary gland. So, the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus stimulates the pituitary gland to release FSH and LH. And so FSH and LH, FSH targets the nerve cells and the seminiferous tubules, and of course the nerve cells promote spermatogenesis and spermiogenesis and formation and development, as we said, into the lumen of the seminiferous tubules. LH targets those interstitial cells and also induces ultimate secretion of testosterone and other androgens from the testes. So really important hormones in terms of initiating even further development, and other hormones that are released in the male reproductive pathway. So testosterone, again, which is ultimately released at the input from LH, is the most important androgen. Does a lot, has a lot of functions, stimulates spermatogenesis and formation of functional maturation of spermatozoa. Can impact CNS function, right? Give a person what we call libido or sex drive and other related behaviors. Stimulates overall metabolism, right? We talked about back in ANP1 about the role of testosterone and muscle growth, but also blood cell formation, protein synthesis. Establishes typically male secondary sex characteristics like facial hair and muscle mass and body size. And helps maintain those accessory glands, which are so important to the overall reproductive pathway. So testosterone is, again, the primary male sex hormone and has quite a wide range of effect on the male. So testosterone production begins about the 7th week or so of fetal development, reaches prenatal peak about 6 months. Surgeon's testosterone stimulates differentiated this male ductural system. One thing we're not talking about is the descent of the testes. That also is associated with testosterone formation and development. So testosterone programs the hypothalamus center. Essentially, that's going to, again, regulate GnRH, FSH, and LH secretion, sexual behaviors, and sexual drive. So the hormone testosterone, again, is playing a significant role in all of these processes. All right, so that is the male reproductive system. We looked a little bit at the anatomy, we looked at gamete formation of the sperm and the accessory glands, the hormones produced, all that stuff. And so now, basically, we're going to do a very similar thing with the female reproductive system and look at all of the reproductive components, the sex hormones, the functional gametes, how it has the capability of nourishing a newborn infant, protect and support a developing embryo, etc. All right? All right, so organs of the female reproductive system. You have the ovaries, which is where the gamete is formed. That is, oocyte ultimately is released into what we call the uterine tubes, which connect to the uterus. The uterus is where, a developing fetus would be, embryo and fetus would ultimately be nourished. That leads to the vagina, and then finally the external genitalia of those structures. And so here you can see the ovary, the uterine tube, which is leading into the uterus. Here's the uterus, and you can see that uterus sits right on top, essentially, of the urinary bladder along this pathway. All right, so let's start with the ovaries. Ovaries are these small almond-shaped organs in the pelvic cavity. And again, you saw these in lab, but we want to take a little bit closer look here at their function. So the primary thing we want to see, obviously, is, like we saw in the male, is the production of female gametes, right? So in the male, we saw the production of sperm. Here we're seeing the production of female gametes, otherwise known as oocytes. That's one primary thing that we're going to look at. Also, secretion of female sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone. And then finally, secretion of inhibin, which is involved in regulatory control of FSH. FSH, again, is a follicle-stimulating hormone that comes from the anterior lobe of the pituitary, and we'll talk about that as well. All right, so ovaries, as you can see right here, attached to the, ultimately connected to the uterine tube, which leads into the uterus, which is in this section. At the end of the uterus, you have the cervix, is the last component of the uterus that leads into the vagina. And so here's a nice shot of the cross-section through an ovary. And you can see, basically, you can see our follicles at various stages of development. Ultimately, they will be released into the uterine tube, which will ultimately work its way down to the uterus. All right, so the process of oogenesis, just like we looked at spermatogenesis, also referred to as ovum production in the female, begins even before birth and does not continue. It really goes into sort of a state of suspended animation until puberty, at which point accelerates and produces a functional oocyte every month, and then ultimately ends at what we call menopause. Right? And so oogenesis, again, like we saw in the male, you have mitosis and meiosis. Mitosis occurs, but again, different from what we saw at the male. This is completed before birth. So mitosis occurs before birth, which is that, again, that initial sort of cell division. And so in the female, you have meiosis 1, which is going to proceed during the 3rd and 7 months of fetal development, and they proceed as far as what's called prophase of meiosis 1. In the prophase of meiosis 1, this process comes to a halt. And at this point, the primary oocytes remain in a state of suspended development. Basically, this is as far as it will go until puberty. And when puberty occurs, we'll see rising levels of FSH, which is follicle-stimulating hormone, from the anterior lobe of the pituitary, and that is going to initiate the next phase, and meiosis will complete, and then ultimately yielding a secondary oocyte, which ultimately potentially could become fertilized. All right? So meiosis 2, again, begins each month after the ovarian cycle begins, and these secondary oocytes leave the ovary And meiosis II is only completed when fertilization occurs. So you need the sperm to actually complete meiosis II. And when we talk about development in the next lecture, we'll see how meiosis II is completed at that point. So it's a little bit different, right, than we saw with the male. Make sure you have a good understanding of how that works and how it stops at meiosis I and all that stuff that we talked about. All right, so this I pretty much talked about already. Between the 3rd and 7th months, primary oocytes prepare for meiosis and stop at prophase of meiosis I. Atresia is where we see the generation of primordial follicles, and so quite a number of these, about 2 million follicles at birth, but ultimately drops through this degeneration of some of these follicles. Okay? And so a process of oogenesis, again, at puberty, FSH triggers essentially the beginning of the ovarian cycle, and each month thereafter, these oocytes are stimulated to then develop further. And so the ovarian cycle, of course, after sexual maturation, we can see the ovarian cycle divided into what's called a follicular phase and a luteal phase. Basically what's happening before the follicle is released and what happens after the follicle is released. So pre-ovulatory and post-ovulatory. Ovulation is when this secondary oocyte is released into the uterine tubes. So ovarian follicles then are specialized structures where we see this oocyte grow and meiosis I proceed, and ultimately these primary oocytes are in clusters called egg nests where they can go through varying stages of development. Right? The primordial follicle then is ultimately where we're seeing the primary oocyte inside this structure. Okay? And so as you can see in this image, you have the primordial follicles, and they at one point will be start to develop into what's called a primary follicle, and then finally a secondary follicle. And this is what we looked at in lab, a tertiary follicle. That's the last stage of this follicular development before the secondary oocyte is released at ovulation. Okay? And so we'll look at that process here in a minute. All right, so the first thing again is you have these follicular cells that contain these primary oocytes. As they go through development, you see primary oocytes continue to form. You see the early stages of the formation of what's called the zona pellucida, which we talked about a little bit in lab as well. And then we start to see the formation of the secondary follicle, and this is ultimately where we start to see the initial stages. You can see the zona pellucida. On the outside, you can see some granulosa cells, and then you can see, of course, the nucleus, where all the genetic material is housed inside the secondary follicle. Finally, the last stage is what's called a tertiary follicle. Again, this is what we looked at in lab. Have a lot of features here that you can see. You have this antrum, where you have this follicular fluid that's contained. You have the nucleus, essentially, the secondary oocyte. You have the corona radiata, which is sort of surrounding, sort of like a crown, right, surrounding the secondary oocyte. And then at that point, based on hormonal activity, ovulation occurs. And so you can see secondary oocyte is basically released. Some of the fluid within this tertiary follicle and that antrum can be released, as you can see in this image here on the right. After that, you have formation of what's called the corpus luteum, so hence the term the luteal phase begins. Corpus luteum then ultimately forms in what's called the corpus albicans, and once we look at sort of the physiology of this in a little bit, we'll see how this hormones play a role and how those are so significant in those processes. All right, so at ovulation then, this secondary oocyte that we saw in this picture, right, is released into the uterine tubes. And so the uterine tube is also referred to as the fallopian tubes. It's this hollow muscular tube, and you can kind of think about it like we talked about the epididymis and the vas deferens, right? It's basically a pathway of transportation going from the ovary to the uterus, right? It's sort of a tube or a pathway. And again, it has smooth muscle, and smooth muscle contractions can sort of push it. There's cilia to help move it as well. So very similar concepts that we explored in the male. Okay, and so here's a nice shot of the different sections of the ovaries, and then the fimbriae, which is the initial portion of the uterine tubes, the infundibulum, the ampulla, the isthmus, and then finally into the uterus. Okay? So again, the lining of the epithelium of the uterine tube has mucus-secreting cells, mucosa surrounded by smooth muscle, of course, which is going to contract and help peristalsis and movement. So here's a nice shot of that. Lumen, you can see the columnar epithelium, attached to a lamina propria, and then nice, abundant, smooth muscle to help with contractions and movement of the secondary oocyte along this pathway. Okay? So uterine tube and oocyte transport, as I said, involves ciliary movement and peristaltic contractions of that smooth muscle, right? Just like we talked about with the male in terms of when the sperm weren't really quite capable of swimming, they needed those contractions of the smooth muscle and the movement of the cilia to move them along their way. Same thing we're seeing here in the uterine tube. So you get ciliary movement, peristaltic contractions, and essentially a few hours before ovulation begins, we start to see the muscles sort of turn on and initiate peristalsis, and the movement from ovulation to the uterus typically takes about 3 or 4 days for the oocyte, secondary oocyte, to move at that point. And for fertilization occurs is really important. A secondary oocyte must meet a spermatozoa in the uterine tube within 12 to 24 hours after ovulation occurs. So it's a pretty small window, right? Fertilization typically occurs between the ampulla and the isthmus, if you look back at the location. And the reason for that is this uterine tube provides a really nice, nutrient-rich environment that can help. It has lipids and sugar that can really help supply the sperm and developing pre-embryo at this point and help promote fertilization. So has to occur in the uterine tube within 12 to 24 hours after ovulation occurs. So that's, again, as I said, a pretty tight window for that to happen, but that's where it's located. And so ultimately, the uterine tube connects to the uterus, of course, right? And the uterus would ultimately provide for a developing embryo. Embryo for the first 8 weeks, and after 8 weeks it's called a fetus, but it's going to actually give the actual enclosement and mechanical attachment and protection. We'll also give it nutrient support, but then also a route for waste removal. So really important from that standpoint. Uterine body is the largest portion of the uterine. The fundus is the rounded portion of the uterine which is attached to the uterine tubes. And the cervix, as I said previously, is the inferior portion, and essentially is the distal end as it extends to the vagina. The external os is also referred to, which ultimately leads into what's called the cervical canal, which is a constricted passageway. We'll talk a little bit more about the cervical canal when we look at development and fertilization. Right? And so here you can see all those structures, right? See the infundibulum, the ampulla, the isthmus, right? So somewhere in this range typically is where fertilization is going to occur. And you can see the sperm, as we're going to find out, have a pretty long way to go, right, to get all the way up to this location. That's why one of the reasons it takes millions of sperm for one sperm to fertilize an egg is because it's a pretty long pathway to get all the way up to that location. So, all right, so the uterine wall, again, if you look at it, really thick muscle. I mean, look at the thickness of that wall. We've talked a lot about this before with the smooth muscle and contractions of the smooth muscle. And as that smooth muscle enlarges, when we look at developing why it starts to contract, basically. But as you can see, a really thick muscular mass called the myometrium. The inner portion, which is the inner wall, is primarily a glandular structure called the endometrium, and the perimetrium is the sort of incomplete serous membrane on the outer surface. So the two parts that we'll talk about most are the myometrium and the endometrium, as they have the most significance in terms of fertilization and the components that we're going to look at. So the myometrium, then, again, is the thickest portion of the uterine wall. Constitute about 90% of the mass of the uterus. has different layers called longitudinal, circular, and oblique layers that basically function differently and also contribute blood flow that's going to ultimately work its way out to the endometrium, so we'll look at that. But ultimately, one of the big physiological components is that it's going to provide the force into the fetus, out of the uterus, and into the vagina during labor, and ultimately delivery. So we'll look at that again more in the next chapter. The other part, about 10% of the uterine mass, is the endometrium. This is the inner lining. It's more of a glandular structure with vascular tissue that will ultimately support the demands of the fetus as it's developing and growing. And so these uterine glands ultimately open into the endometrial surface, and hormones, like estrogen for instance, causes these uterine glands and blood vessels to change depending on these hormonal levels, and that gives us our sort of uterine cycle that we're going to talk about, monthly uterine cycle, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay? But here's a nice shot where you can see sort of what I'm talking about. This is a cross-section through the uterus, and you can see the nice thick wall, myometrium, making up 90% roughly of the wall. And then the endometrium, right, is more of this layer that's closer in to the opening of the cavity inside the uterus. Right? Here again, you can see the myometrium out here, but then you can look closer in and look at the endometrium in terms of the uterine wall. All right, so the endometrium, again, very interesting from a physiological standpoint in terms of what it does and the changes that it undergoes based on hormonal levels. You have two divisions of the endometrium. It's important to know the functional zone and the basilar zone. Functional zone is where we see most of the glandular activity and contributes most of the content or thickness of the endometrial wall. And this, again, functional zone is what undergoes these dramatic changes during these monthly menstrual cycles. The basilar zone is essentially the go-between between the endometrium and the myometrium, and just sort of have branches of these glands and blood vessels. So this basilar zone doesn't change as much. Where you see the change occurring primarily is in this functional zone. Okay? And so what's really important to understand how this works is to understand the blood supply to the endometrium. Okay? The blood supply to the endometrium basically contains these accurate arteries which encircle the endometrium, and then finally the radial arteries, which are ultimately going to supply the basilar and functional zones with straight and spiral arteries respectively. Okay? And so basically you'll see cyclical changes in this endometrium. As I said, the basilar zone pretty much remains the same. The functional zone undergoes all these changes, and it's directly in response to altering of sex hormone levels. And so that's what we'll see in this process. So the uterine cycle or menstrual cycle is basically a repeated series of changes in the endometrial wall or lining that lasts typically about 28 days. They could be anywhere from 21 to 35 days roughly. And again, it responds directly to changes in hormonal level. Okay? And ultimately, menses and the proliferative phase occur, and then you also have what's called the secretory phase that's occurring as well, and we'll look at that. So menses is essentially the degeneration of the functional zone, primarily caused by constriction of these spiral arteries that lead out to this endometrial location. Essentially, constriction of these spiral arteries is going to reduce blood flow and oxygen and nutrients. That causes deterioration of this lining, which the arterial walls rupture, and then ultimately releasing blood and connective tissue into this functional zone as it's being released. And so these degenerated tissues break away, entering the lumen of the uterus, as I was mentioning, and essentially the functional zone is lost. Again, the functional zone is the only layer that's affected. The basilar zone has different arteries, the straight arteries that don't constrict, and they remain intact. And so here's, if you go back to this image, you can see sort of what we're talking about here, right? You see this spiral arteries, right, and straight arteries. And so they sort of change, right, as they go. These spiral arteries are the ones that are going to ultimately change as it constrict during the changing hormone levels. All right, so getting back to where we were, you can see again the appearance of the myometrium, the endometrium of menses, right? So sort of a degradation of the layers in that inner wall of the endometrium, and then menstruation is just the process then of losing that endometrial lining after the change in hormones. And so the endometrial sloughing, as it's referred to, typically can last from 1 to 7 days, and a fair amount of blood is lost. 35 to 50 mLs of blood is lost during this process. Okay? After menstruation occurs, then we move on to what's called the proliferative phase. And basically, proliferative, as the term indicates, is where we see regrowth and regeneration of these cells that were lost. So the epithelial cells of these uterine glandular wall begins to divide and spread and restore across that lining. Further growth and vascularization occurs, and so ultimately, during this proliferative phase, the functional zone is completely restored. And interestingly enough, this is in sync or coordinated with what's happening at the ovaries. The secondary follicles getting larger and getting closer to release. We're starting to see this proliferative phase occur. So the hormones, as we'll talk about in a minute, are driving this process. Okay, and so estrogens are secreted by the follicle that's getting larger and developing. That's going to help sustain this functional zone and also ultimately lead to ovulation. All right, so there's a relationship there between what's going on at the uterine wall and what's going on in the ovaries. And so here you can see during the proliferative phase we get a larger endometrial wall. Functional zone is looking a lot healthier and sort of returning back to being restored and capable. The secretory phase, the endometrial glands now have been reestablished, and now they begin to enlarge and increase rate of secretion. Arteries elongate and spread through the functional zone, and ultimately the secretory phase begins at ovulation, right? So it's sort of like the wall is now prepared and ready in case fertilization occurs, because it's coordinated with what's happening at ovulation. It will persist as long as corpus luteum remains intact. Okay, and so this peaks about 12 days after ovulation and ends once the corpus luteum stops producing stimulatory hormones. And so again, that's driven basically by fertilization. Fertilization occurs. You're going to see that continue, and this phase will remain in prominence. All right, so there we can see the secretory phase and the thickest wall of this endometrium during the uterine cycle. All right, so as I said, the beginning, the first uterine cycle typically occurs in puberty around age 11 or 12, and we call that menarche. And then the termination of the uterine cycle is typically 45 to 55 is what we call menopause. Okay, and so as I said, as I've been talking about, really hormones of this female reproductive system are driving this whole process. And so the pituitary gland is essential, right? It's stimulating this FSH and LH, just like we saw in the male. The gonads are also manufacturing estrogen. And so it forms this pattern that coordinates what's going on at the ovaries, as I was mentioning, with what's going on at the uterus. So that if ovulation occurs, obviously you want the uterus to be prepared and ready in case fertilization occurs. So it's very unique and quite amazing process in terms of the complex coordination of these hormones. And so basically they control the female reproductive cycle and coordinate ovulation and uterus preparation, as I was mentioning. All right, so as I said, GnRH from the hypothalamus, as you recall, that's gonadotropin-releasing hormone, regulates what's ultimately going to release at the anterior pituitary. And GnH pulse frequency change over the course of the ovarian cycle, right? Estrogen and progesterone also can impact what's being released from the hypothalamus. So estrogen are going to increase release of GnRH from the hypothalamus, which is going to increase FSH and LH release from the anterior pituitary. So again, if you're not quite connecting with that information, you might want to review the endocrine chapter when we talked about the hypothalamus and pituitary gland, but they're going to be released and impact that. Progestins, on the other hand, decrease pulse frequency of GnRH and thereby slow FSH and LH release. So again, it's highly coordinated. So the anterior lobe pituitary, again, responds to these GnRH frequencies and ultimately then releases the hormone accordingly. Okay, so FSH is released, and we'll start to see hormones being driven and primordial follicles develop, as the term FSH is follicle-stimulating hormone, so that should make sense that it's stimulating follicular development. Andro is also a steroid hormone that stimulates synthesis of estrogen, but don't worry that much about that. The interstitial cells, again, sort of like we saw in the male, are also helping form different hormones. The different types of estrogens, estradiol is a quite prominent hormone. Estrogen is really the most significant one that we're going to see and talk about in terms of its formation and its impact. So, estrogen is kind of like the male equivalent of testosterone, or female equivalent of testosterone is for the male. Very significant hormone, has quite a significant impact not only on the reproductive system, but other parts of the body, right? Stimulates bone and muscle growth, maintains female characters, secondary sex characteristics like hair distribution or adipose tissue, can impact the central nervous system, initiate repair and growth of the endometrium, as we were just talking about. So it has quite a few effects. And so what's really nice about this next slide, now we take time to sort of look and see what happens in this slide. It sort of summarizes what's happening with hormone levels, what's happening at the ovary, and then ultimately also what's happening at the uterus, as we'll see in just a minute. But as you can see, the cycle begins with follicular development. As you know, the follicular development is ultimately moving towards a tertiary follicle before ovulation. And so, as you can see, GnRH, right, is being stimulated by estrogen, as we talked about before. So as estrogen goes up, you can see what's happening to GnRH is going up. And as GnRH goes up, as it peaks, you're going to see an increase in FSH and LH accordingly, which is going to stimulate ovulation to occur. And so you can see when estrogen goes up, right, about the same time that ovulation occurs. Right? Now, what's happening at the endometrium? Okay, at the end of the cycle, right, we're seeing destruction initially of this functional zone, but as estrogen levels start to go up, and this is probably easy to look at, and you might want to look at this in your textbook because it shows it all in one continuous chart. As estrogen levels go up, you can see repair and regeneration of the functional zone is also increasing. Okay? And then during that time, also as it gets stronger and stronger, we see uterus contributing to increasing in the effectiveness and the secretory phase that is occurring at the ovaries. And so if you look back, you can see the corpus luteum is releasing components that are going to contribute to that. But you can see estrogen levels are going down more. But look at progesterone, that is going up. Progesterone is a really important hormone. Pro meaning in favor, gest meaning gestation, and so this hormone is going to have a significant role in fertilization and development if that does in fact occur. So anyway, take a look at this chart. Make sure you have a good understanding of how the components are related to one another. All right. So, and then finally, in these last slides, this is just sort of a summary of what we talked about in terms of regulating the female reproductive cycle. Earlier, as we saw, estrogen levels are low, GnRH pulse frequency is low, but as we start to see that develop, right, estrogen count levels are going up, GnRH pulse frequency is going up accordingly. And then in the follicular phase, when the switchover occurs, estrogen levels exceed threshold, resulting in massive release of LH from the anterior lobe of the pituitary, and LH causes completion of meiosis I, rupture of the follicular wall, and leads to ovulation. Okay? The luteal phase, as I was saying, LH levels trigger ovulation, promote progesterone and trigger formation of the corpus luteum, as I was mentioning. Right? And so these are all really important components to the overall process. A luteal phase, again, causes progesterone levels to remain high for about a week. Unless pregnancy occurs, that corpus luteum is going to begin to degenerate, and progesterone and estrogen levels will drop. If pregnancy does occur, corpus luteum will not generate, and progesterone levels will remain elevated. So it's sort of an interesting process in terms of how that works. Okay? And so we'll look at that more in when we look at development. All right? And so the proliferation phase continues, and then finally, we see a change in body temperature as well. So anyway, review that last chart. That's sort of the written part that goes along with the chart. It gives you a nice sort of overall view of what's happening along those steps. So anyway, so that wraps up the female reproductive system and wraps up the lecture as well. So as you see, we talked about many different anatomical structures as well as the physiological formation of these gametes and hormones and the impact these hormones are having on both these systems. So anyway, so that's it for this lecture. We'll do one more, the development, and we'll sort of see now, okay, now that we have seen where these gametes come from and how they're formed and at a certain stage of development, now we can look at, okay, what happens when they fuse and what happens in gestation and how is this formed during those 9 months. So we'll look at that next in the last chapter of the semester. All right?